Hey guys, what's up? Yeah, I know, long time. I have completely broken the schedule that I wanted to do, but I wanted to at least get something off for December so I can give you guys at least a little something for, Christmas or Yule or, Hanukkah, whatever it is that you guys happen to, celebrate, if you celebrate at all. So, no, this isn't exactly, there's something else I'd want to do if I was actually going to give a, holiday present. And if I have the time to do it, then I'll hopefully get to do it. It just so happens that I happen to work for a company that is very busy around this time of year, which has eaten up a lot of my own personal time. But I had to get this one off because it's been burning in my head and I really want to get it going, so got it going. Before we get on to it, I just wanted to state, even though I've stated this many times before, however I feel like can't state it enough, how much I appreciate a lot of the well thought out and well researched comments that I tend to get when I bring up martial arts videos or even philosophical videos or whatnot, because you guys tend to bring up some really good points. Sometimes you guys bring up things I didn't know, or you'll bring up things I know but you'll add some more depth or a different angle to it that I find to be very interesting. I am very thankful that my comment section doesn't devolve into the usual realm of scum and villainy that you tend to associate with YouTube comment sections. Mine, thankfully, tends to be, pretty humane, pretty civilized. And not only that, but you tend to pick up some really good stuff. Jay Chang, for instance, and yes, I'm calling you out by name, he tends to bring up some really good points and some really interesting insights underneath my martial arts themed videos. George Coffey as well. I tend to like some of the things that he brings to the table. By the way, I am sorry. Yeah, I did it. See, I warned you it was going to happen. I know you said that you didn't want, I shouldn't go all baby faced, but it had to be done. At least I'm not baby faced now, right? The hair's growing, so cut me some slack. It will get back to the length it was before. My beards tend to grow pretty quickly, so, for beards, that is. But that's not the subject for this. Anyway, just want to say that I really appreciate the insights you bring forth, and they actually give me ideas for new videos. In fact, it was looking at the comment section that gave me the idea to want to go further with the last video, go a little bit further to the topic of weight and length. And when it comes to jian, when it comes to, swords like these, I want to talk as broadly as I can on how jian were used through the different periods of when it comes to martial arts fighting, and what the length and weight might contribute to that, how it influenced it, how how usage influenced both length and weight and vice versa. Now, what I may say might not be, I'm going to just say off the bat that some of this, yes, it's based on things I've researched, but other things are based on my own particular ideas from what I've seen of that research. So you may not agree completely with what I said, which is why, once again, I have to point back to the comment section, because there have been other videos where I've stated things and you guys have disagreed and you've brought up something that was really interesting. So I just hope to see some more further discussion of that. I really do appreciate the points that you guys bring up. So enough of that, let's get on to it. The one thing that I need to stress first is when it comes to the use of this thing, what its primary function is. When we're looking at swords, you can very roughly put them in two different categories. Well, I'll say three. And again, these are rough categories. I know the Shark Tank I'm diving into when I'm talking about this, but you got your cutters, you got your thrusters, and then you got that realm in between, the ones that you try to marry the two different, techniques. And that pretty much is what it boils down to. Are you using a thrusting sword? Are you using a cutting sword? Or are you using one that tries to have the best of both worlds? And of course, you're going to be sacrificing a little bit of one for the other. Now, I have long had a problem with the idea that a jian is purely a thrusting sword, to the point where some people will compare them to rapiers. I really don't think that's what they are. From the forms I've seen to the bits that I've practiced, to how I, see other, experts actually using the weapon, there are clearly cutting motions with the weapon. If I was to compare this to a Western sword, I would not be comparing it to a rapier. And I know that in and of itself, you're using rapier, and then of course you got some people pointing out, well, there were rapier that could cut, and they do cut. Yes, I know. And I also know that, rapier itself can be a very broad term, because some rapier do look like the thin weapons that we associate that word with. And then you had those that also had wider blades that could cut. But I will contend that I doubt that they were this wide. The Western weapons I can think of that have blades similar to these are more, what I would consider, I would use the broad term side swords. And you know what I'm talking about when I say side sword, which is an evolution of the arming sword. And I'm sure someone's going to correct me on that, but that's what I remembered from the bit of research I saw. But yeah, these blades were made for both cutting and thrusting. Jian are cut and thrust swords. And that's how they're used, that's how they're practiced, and that's what I firmly hold to. So that being said, if the weapon is to be used in that way, then the weight and length should also lend to that. And I think that's what we see. What's interesting, however, is which way does the fighter lean? Does he lean more toward thrusting or cutting? And as with Western arts, the answer lies in, well, how was the blade made? Was it made with a wide blade? Was it made with a more narrow one? Is the blade short? Is it long? And that gives us a clue. Now, one thing that I found interesting was when I was researching just martial arts in general, and they were talking about the first usage of swords, how the term, face stabbing or face thrusting kept coming up with earlier examples of martial arts, Chinese martial arts. And of course, the older swords were jian. They were shorter bronze weapons, probably this length. But you see like examples and even, written accounts of contests where they're thrusting toward the face. And that right away tells me, okay, thrusting weapons. They were used a lot for thrusting. But they were wide blades. They weren't thin, narrow, weapons. Even the daggers were kind of wide bladed, so they were kind of used for cutting as well. And there are accounts of that as well, which makes sense when you think of the natural way that people tend to use objects. Like if you don't have any martial arts training or very little martial arts training, and I put a stick in your hand, what are you more inclined to do with it if you were going to defend yourself? Are you going to be going like this with it, or are you going to be going like this with it? See what I mean? So this is a more natural motion. This takes a little bit more, thought. And also to deliver it properly, it takes a little bit more training. This, even a badly made cut's still gonna do damage, And even a blunt weapon, you do this, you're gonna do damage. That's why baseball bats tend to be popular nowadays when you want to fight somebody. And why we have certain laws when it comes to carrying bats. But I'm going a bit off topic. What I found when you're looking throughout many different antique pieces, and I have to be careful here, somebody pointed out when I'm saying antiques, they aren't made one way. I should have made that a little bit more clear in the last video. I thought I did, but I didn't. I do understand that antiques aren't all, it's antiques and they run the gamut, but there is a rough uniform range that you can kind of see when it comes to these things. There's a certain average. And again, I know I'm kind of creeping into the Shark Tank here, but there's a kind of, you can kind of get a general range of weights and lengths. And what I found as I'm constantly researching this is that these weapons tended to be used in a kind of cut and thrust fashion. But I noticed that you tend to accentuate the thrust more the less this became a commonly used weapon. We got to remember that the jian was supplanted by the Dao pretty early, pretty quickly. Like once people saw how these cavalry weapons are really messing us up, they pretty much jumped to that single-edged version and never looked back. The jian pretty much became a weapon of status. It was a weapon of status before, but it definitely became one, once it became supplanted by the Dao. Even generals, despite the fact that generals are carrying these, after a while they started using the Dao way more. So this became more of a ceremonial weapon and a civilian's weapon. And even the civilians after a while were like, well, the Dao cut better. So they were, leaning more towards that. Again, this is a more natural motion than this. This, I have to be careful here also. When I'm stating that this is a more sophisticated weapon, I'm not trying to say that Dao usage is somehow cumbersome or brain dead or like a dumb man's weapon. There are sophisticated techniques with the Dao as well. In fact, there's certain Dao that are pretty much associated with more sophisticated usage. In fact, I think that's one of the weird ironies of the Dao. When we think of the Dao today, or at least the stereotypical Dao, when it's associated with Kung Fu, it tends to be the oxtail Dao, which is, I know people are going to rankle at this, but that weapon was specifically designed for people who didn't have as much martial arts training. That's the Dao that you can actually link to simpler movements. The more commonly used Dao, or more of the willow leaf sabers, the goose quill sabers, those type of Dao, which if you notice are not as wide, are a little bit more narrow, and it's easier to thrust with those. So they did have more sophisticated techniques with those weapons. The oxtail saber, the oxtail Dao, Yue Dao, if I remember how, I was pretty much butchering the name, but that's what it is. That's supposed to be the more, machete type weapon. And the funny thing is, these days we practice, with that weapon using more sophisticated forms. And I'm thinking to myself, some of the forms that you guys are practicing with, you probably should be using other Dao instead, but that's a whole other topic. Anyway, I went off track. The point I'm trying to make is this weapon has even more sophisticated techniques because you're focusing on marrying both cut and thrust. But there was more of an emphasis on the thrust as time went on. The thrust was always there. As again, it's talking about, the Giddy, you see murals and old pictures and old stories about face thrusting contests, using the length. And of course, for a thrusting weapon, you want that length advantage. You saw that with Western martial arts as well. The more the weapon was a thruster, the more you start lengthening the blade and the more you start narrowing it out. I'm not saying that the jian soon got to the point where the thrust became the main way to use it above all else, but you do see more mincing cuts with certain forms as time went on. There's still some really good cuts, these type of motions you happen to employ with the jian, quick motions like that, where you're emphasizing the point a little bit more, but it's, there's still kind of like that mincing type motion. You're not really delivering big cuts with those unless they happen to be the two-handers. And even the two-handers, there's still a little bit more of a lightness with its movement, a bit more precise type movement that you're doing with it. And that leads me to weight. Now, I kind of briefly touched on length, but let's just say that if you're going to be leaning more to the thrusting aspect of things, you're going to want the blades to be a little bit longer and a little bit more slender. But then we get to the weight, and this is where things get interesting. Just like with any other sword, the weight of the weapon, the shape of the blade, and the point of balance tells you a lot about how that weapon is to be used. Now, I stated before that I really have a problem with a jian that is 3 pounds and up. Because, again, if you're working with a weapon that you're doing a lot of this with, unless you got some really strong forearms and some strong sinews in your wrist, that's going to wear you out after a while. A jian that's 3 pounds. I've seen examples of these. They tend to have wider blades, and they're obviously used for cutting. You're not doing much of this with it. Something a little bit lighter, that's, with more point control, where the point of balance is closer to your hand, that's more of a thruster. The heavier cutting weapons have that point of balance more forward, and we do see examples of jian like that. But those tend to be the heavier ones, and those tend to be the ones where the blades are not as long and are definitely wider. What's interesting to me, however, is that I've seen a lot of jian forms, a lot of them modern wushu interpretations, but I've seen a lot of other ones that supposedly harken back to, more ancient times when this weapon was, more used for war rather than something that you just carried around for, status purposes or ceremonial usage, as Taoist priests, doing exorcisms and stuff with them. And what I've found is that you still see, even with these older forms, a good bit of emphasis on the point. I don't really see a lot of jian forms where cutting is the main weapon used, the main technique that's used for it. Which makes me wonder, what were these heavier jian for? These ones with the much wider blades, and I mean, back in the past, yeah, you saw that all the time, for a variety of reasons. The type of metal used, the techniques used at the time, yeah, you would see wider ones. But then later on, you're seeing during the Ming and Qing dynasties some examples of jian with blades wider than these and shorter than this. Like this is a 32-inch blade here, and we see some with shorter blades. We're talking about like 26 inches, 25 inches with wider blades. And they're obviously more of a cutting weapon. They do have some short examples, like they're almost like dagger, like I would say like, short sword length jian. But they have narrow blades, so they're used for close quarters fighting and for quick thrusting and stabbing and such, which would make sense if you're fighting. Again, jian were, personal weapons, not necessarily war weapons, especially during the later dynasty periods. If you're carrying this as a personal, self-protection item and you happen to be fighting, in narrow areas, a shorter blade that you can quickly thrust with makes a lot more sense, right? But again, you find these heavier ones where the point of balance is much more forward, and it makes me wonder, what was the style used for these? And were they given to people who didn't necessarily have a high or at least an intermediate level of martial arts skill? The only style I can think of right off the bat that would probably have more of an emphasis on cuts are Xingyi sword forms. Those to me are rather interesting. I've seen a few Xingyi weapons forms, and not only do I like them for their simplicity, and I don't say simple as in, not sophisticated. Xingyi weapons forms are very sophisticated, but they also are more direct and very no nonsense. And I see a lot of this. A lot of and sometimes it almost seems like they're holding it in two hands. Remember what I said about how this can really transfer into this? And sometimes I just see Xingyi guys straight up just forget this. They just hold it in two hands and they do and like a lot of this. There's a lot of rolling over and cuts like that, and then cut like that in Xingyi forms. So it makes me wonder if these heavier weapons, these wider blades, were meant to be used with those. However, the thing that makes me waver on that is the fact that, again, it's two-handed usage. And a lot of, you do see, again, examples of Xingyi weapons where the blades are longer. Now, granted, the Dao tends to be a little bit more associated with Xingyi than the jian, for a lot of obvious reasons. But I do still see certain, examples of Xingyi guys using the sword. You see sometimes old pictures of Xingyi practitioners where they have the long, of a jian, and those blades are long. And I could easily see them employing it in that snappy, forward step motion where, again, that triple step they do to deliver the power in that final blow where it tense up and boom, can really be delivered to that point for a good thrust or a good cut. For techniques like that, you need a weapon that can hold on to that. That you kind of need that balance that we tend to associate these days with the bigger jian, where the point of balance is about 4 to 5 inches from the handguard. I don't really see that as something, or something a little bit heavier, like I said. I mean, I could also see that, especially with the cuts, you could probably push it up to 6 inches along the blade, maybe even further than that, though that's really starting to mess with the weight. I guess the thing is, when I happen to see jian with those big, fat, wide blades, and I'm making it sound like they're like great swords or something. They're not that wide, but they're fairly wide for a jian. It's kind of surprising to see that width for a more contemporary type blade. Like, again, Qing era, late Qing era, Qing dynasty era blade, and yet they're that wide. It's making me wonder if they were made more for, are they made for people who know how to use the weapon, who have a particular more cutting oriented style in mind? Excuse me. Or was it made more for somebody who, they may see a lot of combat or as a self-defense weapon, but they aren't necessarily swordsmen, so to speak. Like, this isn't really their level of art. Like, they don't focus on fine swordsmanship. They just want something that's going to be able to cut somebody up and get going. I wonder that sometimes with the heavier weapons. This video has gone on way long, and I've kind of rambled, but I do want to touch on this one last thing when it comes to length and weight on sword. And then typically with jian, I'm finding with certain people, I'm seeing this in certain circles, a kind of backlash against the idea of very light jian being the standard. And I could understand that because, again, there's this idea that jian are supposed to be these super flimsy, very whippy type weapons, and it makes no sense for a weapon that you're supposed to thrust with. No, they're supposed to be substantial weapons. You know, there's a proper stiffness in the blade for a good thrust and good mass for a good delivery on the cut, especially for a weapon that's supposed to be able to do both. However, I'm wondering if there's a little bit too much emphasis on saying, oh, these things were heavy, these things were heavy, these things were heavy. Yeah, they had weight, but we're not talking about weapons that were like 4 or 5 pounds here. But yet I'm finding people like, yeah, they're supposed to have this forward weight balance. And it's like, chill out. Remember, there isn't that, no matter what culture you're looking at, Western, Eastern, Japanese, Chinese, German, English, French, whatever, we're pretty much built the same way. And we've stumbled upon many of the same things when it comes to making weapons and using weapons. And one thing we found is that using things that are overly cumbersome and heavy wear us out. Whereas using something that's a bit more better balanced for the technique you're trying to use will yield better results. And so many examples I'm seeing when it comes to weapons that are being made for use in one hand or even two, is a range that you're not supposed to go beyond when it comes to point of balance, weight, and length when it comes to these techniques. So I guess this whole long rambling thing that I was just saying was just for me leading up to that main point, that we have to consider when you're trying to figure out what the quote-unquote proper length or weight of your sword is and what a jian is. Well, what are you using it for? Are you using it primarily for thrusting and cutting? If so, then the weight and the length should match that. If you are using, if your style is more point oriented and yet you're using a jian that's like 3.3 pounds with a wide blade and it's not that long, you're probably using the wrong weapon for the job. And if I'm going to be going into my own personal opinion, if you're going to say, well, then that means it was made more for cutting. Okay, fine. Show me a style where the cut is more, is emphasized more than the thrust when it comes to the jian, and maybe you would have a point. Excuse the expression. But I've yet to see a form like that. I've yet to see a style like that. Even styles that, that tend to have a lot of cuts in it, you will still find a lot of thrusts as well. Because let's face it, look at the shape of the blade. This was meant to be used with the thrust. Not only the thrust, but it was meant to be used with a thrust nonetheless. So yeah, I guess it's more of my kind of rambly type, thoughts on the influences on weight and length when it comes to the jian. And I guess with any sword, really, you have to consider what the things are used for and look at it in that context if you're trying to figure out what the proper weight and length should be. So that's it. Hope you guys found something, got something out of it. And yeah, catch you guys later. You're still here? Okay then, real quick. I know it's a tradition for me at the end of the year to do something special. Last time, before it was always the whole Dark Souls stuff, where I, dive into that, do that. I wouldn't mind doing that again. It's fun diving into Dark Souls and seeing how far I can get. Though a part of me still really wants to get that mini Tekken 7 tournament out the way. I'm just itching for it. I don't really need major experts. I just need people who have fun playing the game. There are a few friends of mine who might be down for that, like maybe 2 or 3 other people I can add. But I really would like at least 6. I know you guys play other games, but if there's any one of you watching this that are at least interested in Tekken 7 on the PC, because unfortunately there's no freaking crossplay, please let me know. I would really love, that would be great for New Year's, having a mini tournament thing and just having fun, trash talking each other and beating the crap out of one another. It's so much freaking fun. If I can't get that off the ground, then I do have some other ideas. And I probably wouldn't mind, I haven't done a Q&A in God knows how long. I need to get back to doing those. I should try to pull one out, get one going, before the year ends. So if hopefully I can get some time going on, I can, get right into that. So yeah, that's that. I got nothing else right now. You can leave now. Bye.